The birthday cake was still in the break room when Marcus Holt called me into his office and ended 7 years. I know because I could smell it from the hallway on the way to his door. Vanilla frosting drifting past the printer room. The warm particular sweetness of something Deb Kwan had ordered that morning from the bakery on Wicker Park. The one we both liked that was technically 3 blocks out of the way, and worth it anyway. Deb did this every year. Same cake, same bakery, same casual shrug when I told her she didn't have to. Every year she said it was practically a tax write-off and laughed at herself when she said it. Full volume, no reservation. The laugh of someone who doesn't audit whether the joke earned that much response. Every year the cake sat on the break room table under a paper sign in her careful block letters. Happy birthday, Clara. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end. Something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. And every year I ate a piece at my desk with a plastic fork and thought about how strange it is to be known that specifically by someone who started as a coworker and became the only person in that building who could read the particular set of my shoulders across a conference room table and know before I said anything that something was wrong. This year the cake had lemon filling. Deb had texted me at 7:30 to tell me. She remembered a comment I had made 2 years ago in a conversation I barely recalled, something about lemon filling being the one birthday cake improvement worth the effort. She had carried that detail for 2 years and acted on it without making a thing of it. I was 35 years old on that Tuesday in March. That is the number that sets the weight for everything that follows. A person can be fired on any Tuesday. But a person who gets fired on their birthday finds out something specific and permanent about the person who scheduled it, something that no budget language or restructuring logic can explain away, because the timing means someone checked the calendar and chose that date anyway. I would think about that choice for a long time. Not to nurse the hurt of it. I thought about it because it was the most accurate information I had about the man I had worked for, more accurate than anything in 7 years of performance reviews or quarterly check-ins or the polished language of a senior hire who believed he was building something together with his people. A man who fires someone on their birthday without the date registering is a man who has not been seeing the person at all. Only the function. It is clarifying to be seen that clearly for what you are not. Let me go back to where it actually started, which was not 7 years ago and not in that office. It started in a Wicker Park apartment with a mattress on the floor, and a wooden TV tray that served as a desk and a folder of business cards from people I had met at the Thompson Hotel Industry Mixer in the second week after I arrived in the city. I had driven from Columbus, Ohio in a car with a cracked windshield and 2 boxes of books and the particular brand of certainty a person carries at 23 before they understand that certainty is not a resource. It is a starting point. My name is Clara Reeves. I grew up in Columbus, the only child of Margaret Reeves, who worked for 22 years as a records coordinator at an insurance company, and who raised me in a 3-bedroom house on Greenlawn Avenue with a vegetable garden in the back that she tended the way she tended everything worth keeping, with patient and specific attention. My father had left when I was 4. I did not experience this as a wound exactly, not then because I did not have enough context for what was missing. I experienced it as the shape of my world, which was my mother and me and the house and the garden and the neighbors whose names she knew because she paid attention to people the way some people pay attention to the sky. I was good at school. Not the kind of good that gets you noticed in the first 5 minutes. The kind that means you stay with a problem past the point where other people put it down, because sitting with difficulty past the comfortable threshold was the skill my particular childhood developed most reliably. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and 3 part-time jobs. I studied communications because I had a theory, unformed but persistent, that what most institutional failures had in common was an inability to say clearly what they meant. I wanted to understand how that broke and how it got fixed. I interned 2 summers at a regional PR firm in Columbus where I spent most of my time writing press releases about pesticide compliance and agricultural insurance. Not glamorous, but it taught me to care about things other people find boring, which turns out to be one of the more durable professional skills there is. You cannot build a real working relationship with someone in the grain elevator business if you cannot bring yourself to care, even a little, about the grain elevator business. Even on a Tuesday in February when you are 22 and would rather be doing almost anything else. I moved to Chicago at 23 because that was where the jobs were, and because staying in Columbus at 23 felt, at the time, like a permanent decision I was not yet ready to make. I got a job as an account coordinator at a small firm called Pallister Group. Entry level. Not much money. A desk in the open floor plan next to a man named Trevor who ate soup at his desk every afternoon and who was competent and not unkind and who taught me, entirely by accident, that you can work 18 inches from someone for 3 years and not know them at all if neither of you ever really tries. I learned the actual business at Pallister. Not the version that gets taught in programs, not the theory of it, but the mechanics. What a client relationship looks like when it is working and when it is not. The specific difference between a firm that retains clients across multiple contract cycles and one that watches them walk after the first. The answer was simpler than most firms wanted to accept. It was attention. Real and sustained and specific attention to what the client actually needed, rather than what the firm's service offering said they should need. It was remembering that a company's operations director had mentioned his daughter's first year of college in passing on a call in March and asking about it in October. It was reading the trade publication for each client's industry every week without being asked, not because it was in a job description but because the client who is surprised that their account manager knows the landscape of their world becomes a client who trusts you, and the client who trusts you stays. I also learned something at Pallister that nobody said to me directly but that the work taught through repetition. I learned that the question clients are most afraid to ask is not the strategic question. The strategic question they will ask openly, in a meeting with the full room present. The question they are afraid to ask is the simpler one, the one that reveals they are uncertain about a decision already made, or that something is not working the way the public announcement suggested it was working. Those questions come at the end of calls when most of the agenda has been handled and the other people have signed off and there is just the two of you and the client says actually, one more thing. I learned to stay on the line for that moment. I learned that the one more thing was almost always the actual thing. I was good at that part. Not the flashy part, not the pitch room performance, not the deck that opens like a movie. I was good at the long part. The staying part. The part that does not get applauded. After 3 years at Pallister, I left for Holt Strategic Partners, which Marcus Holt had founded 5 years earlier and was growing in the particular aggressive way that founders grow things when they have not yet distinguished between the company's momentum and their own. The job was a step up in title and salary and in the scope of clients the firm handled. Marcus interviewed me twice across the conference table in the room with the river view. He asked sharp questions and listened with what appeared to be genuine evaluation rather than the performance of it. He offered me a salary 10% above what I had asked for, which I learned later was a deliberate tactic. He did it with people he thought he was acquiring for less than their value. The premium created a debt of gratitude he could spend slowly across years. The first 2 years at Holt were the best work I had done. For mid-sized accounts and enough actual latitude to do the job rather than perform someone else's version of it. Marcus was charismatic and good at beginnings. The pitch, the first meeting, the close. Deb was managing her own accounts with the organized warmth that made her extraordinary at client work and impossible to replace. A strategist named Roland Creighton who had 20 years in brand positioning was producing work I found genuinely rigorous. The firm had the quality in those years of a place where the people made the thing real. The problem was quiet and structural. Marcus had built the firm and he believed its reputation was his achievement, which was true in the sense that he had started it and not true in the sense that he understood. He believed it the way people believe things they need in order to maintain the structure of how they see themselves. And because he stood at the front of every room and spoke with the fluid confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder whether he belongs, the clients believed it too at first, which kept the belief functional longer than it should have been. 8 months after I joined, Marcus came into my office late on a Thursday afternoon and asked me to do him a favor. He had a meeting the following Tuesday with a prospective client called Marchetti Group, a manufacturing conglomerate headquartered in Detroit with regional operations across the Midwest. The founder's son had recently taken over as CEO, and was in the process of repositioning the company away from its legacy in auto parts manufacturing toward a broader industrial supply model. They needed strategic communications support for the transition. Marcus had gotten the meeting through a contact. He needed a brief by Monday morning. I spent the weekend reading, not just Marchetti Group's own materials, their annual reports, investor communications, recent press releases, the trade press covering the industrial supply sector, profiles of Vincent Marchetti Jr., who had an engineering degree from Michigan and had spent 8 years inside the company before taking the chief executive role, which meant he understood the operations in a way that purely financial successors often did not. A profile of his father, Vincent Sr., who had founded the company in 1978 with a single auto parts plant in Pontiac and who was, by every account I read, a man of very high standards and very few unnecessary words. Analysis of what the structural shift away from automotive manufacturing meant for legacy regional suppliers, and why the communication challenges of that pivot were different from standard repositioning work. By Sunday evening I had a draft 60 pages long. I cut it to 22. I sent it to Marcus at 10 that night with a note that said the last 4 pages were background I thought might be useful in the room. Marcus took the brief into the meeting Tuesday morning. He called me at 2 in the afternoon. They want to move forward, he said. Vincent Jr. asked who wrote the brief and I told him my firm. He said it was the first pitch document he had read in 3 years that mentioned something he had not already heard 100 times. My firm. Not the name of the person who had spent the weekend in the trade press. My firm. I told myself that was how it worked. The invisible labor was the job. The work's quality was the point. I told myself that for 7 years. I became lead account manager on Marchetti Group 3 months into the engagement. Marcus ran the relationship nominally, meaning he appeared at quarterly check-ins and annual strategy reviews, and told Vincent Jr. that he personally stayed close to accounts of this importance. The daily work was mine. The strategy calls, the crisis communications during their first acquisition announcement, the executive transition campaign when Vincent Sr. formally stepped back, the positioning response when a competitor made a public push to pull away 3 of their regional clients with an aggressive counteroffer. Every piece of it mine. Vincent Jr. was not an easy client. He was blunt and demanding and had a specific low tolerance for language that cushioned a recommendation rather than making it. He called me once at 7 in the morning to say that a memo I had circulated the previous day was full of words that meant nothing and that he needed the actual recommendation, stripped of the softening around it, on his desk by noon. I hung up and rewrote the memo in 40 minutes. Half the length. Every sentence direct. He called back at 2 and said it was what he needed. After that he called me first. When something broke, when something was uncertain, when he needed a read before the meeting rather than after it. We had never had a warm relationship in the conventional sense. What we had was trust, the specific variety that accumulates between 2 people who each believe the other will tell them the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Marcus believed Vincent Jr.'s trust was trust in the firm. He had attended the quarterly meetings and shaken hands, and received the warmth that clients extend to the person they believe is responsible for their results. He did not know about the 7 a.m. calls. He had never asked. I had been covering for this dynamic for years without naming it. There was the strategy brief I wrote for the Indiana acquisition announcement that Marcus presented in the formal review meeting while I sat 2 chairs to his left and said nothing. There was the positioning document for the regulatory inquiry response that went out under the firm's letterhead and that Marcus sent a separate cover note with, describing it to Vincent Jr.'s team as the result of extensive internal deliberation, which it was, in the sense that I had deliberated for 3 days and he had read it the morning it was due. There was the industry trend analysis I produced every quarter as background research for strategy calls, 12 pages of synthesized reporting that Marcus forwarded to 3 other clients as value add, which it was because the work was good but which he had not written and did not fully understand the methodology behind. I know this because he asked me once what a specific index one had referenced meant, in a voice that made clear he was asking because he was going to need to explain it to someone and wanted the answer in a form he could use. I gave him the answer. I always gave him the answer. That was the shape of those 7 years. I managed the Marchetti account for 4 years. Through the Indiana acquisition of a steel components manufacturer in Terre Haute that doubled the company's production footprint overnight, and required a communications plan that had to reach 3 different audiences: investors who needed confidence, employees at the acquired company who needed honesty, and regional customers who needed continuity. Vincent Jr. called me 4 times in the 72 hours before the announcement went public. Each call was about a different piece of the message, a different concern, a different audience that had not been fully addressed in the draft we had. I revised the announcement language twice overnight. The final version held up without a single material question from the press in the subsequent week, which Vincent Jr. noted in an email to me and did not copy Marcus on. Through the federal regulatory inquiry that required every piece of external communication to be precise and unhurried in ways that left no margin for hedging. The inquiry lasted 4 months. I spoke with their general counsel's office every Wednesday for 16 weeks, reviewed every public statement before release, and helped draft the response to the one analyst who asked a question in their quarterly earnings call that could have opened a line of speculation if it had been handled carelessly. It was handled correctly. The inquiry closed without incident. Through a full brand repositioning that we delivered 8 weeks ahead of the contracted schedule, because I had worked directly with their internal communications team, moving alongside their process rather than running our firm's standard project management sequence, which added 4 weeks to every engagement through checkpoints I had come to believe were designed to justify billing hours rather than to improve the work. During those 4 years, I also brought in 3 additional manufacturing clients through relationships I had built on my own. 2 came through direct referrals from Marchetti Group. 1 came through a connection from an industry conference I had attended on my own time and my own registration fee. They were mid-sized accounts, not Marchetti's scale, but healthy, growing, and managed with the same approach, specific attention and a consistent refusal to substitute process for substance. When I ran the numbers in February, roughly 42% of the firm's annual revenue moved through work I was either leading directly or supervising closely. Marcus did not know this number. He knew the firm was healthy. He did not ask why. The first signs of the merger appeared in October, about 5 months before my birthday. I did not recognize them as merger signals at first. I recognized them as the pattern of a senior decision-maker who had something on his mind that he was not distributing downward. 3 internal strategy meetings in October canceled without rescheduling. Marcus in New York twice in November, both on short notice, both with instructions to hold his calls and no further detail. In December, a man I did not recognize sat in the conference room with the Riverview for 2 hours with Marcus and Brad Tillis, the firm's CFO, who was a man of genuine composure, the kind who had watched genuinely bad news arrive across that table without changing his expression. Brad Tillis made an expression during that meeting. I watched him through the glass partition from across the floor and could not read it, which meant it was either very good or very significant news, and either way it was news that mattered. Deb and I had lunch most Wednesdays at the Vietnamese place 2 blocks north of the office, a habit we'd kept for 4 years. She had a running theory about the pho there, that it had functional restorative properties she was building observational evidence for. In January, she set down her chopsticks and asked me directly whether Marcus had told me anything about the firm's direction. Nothing specific, I said. She pressed her lips together in the way she does when she is deciding how much to share. Then, he had lunch with Garrett Moreau last month. I had to look up who that was when I got back to my desk. Garrett Moreau was the executive chairman of Meridian Group, a New York-based marketing and communications holding company that had spent 5 years acquiring regional mid-sized firms throughout the Midwest and the Northeast. Their acquisition model was consistent. They bought firms with strong regional client books, integrated the accounts into the Meridian network, standardized service delivery, and reduced headcount significantly in the first operating year. So that was what was happening. I thought about it for several days without saying anything to anyone except Petra Osei. Petra had been my attorney for 3 years, since a contract dispute with a vendor early in my time at Holt. She practiced employment and contract law from a West Loop office, and had no professional use for softening any conversation she was part of. I called her not to alarm her but because she is the person I call when I want to think out loud with someone who will correct my thinking if it is wrong, without managing my feelings about the correction. She asked immediately about my employment agreement, whether I had read the non-compete provisions recently. I had signed a non-compete at the beginning of my employment. 2 years 50 miles from Chicago, same industry. Standard for its type. I had signed it at 26 without reading it with the thoroughness I would have brought to a client contract, because I had no intention of leaving and the firm's attorney had presented it as routine. Petra had a copy from our earlier work and pulled it on the call. She said the provision was enforceable on its face and vulnerable in 2 places. My salary was above the threshold where Illinois law required additional consideration at signing, and that consideration had not been provided. There were also questions about whether the scope was appropriately narrowed. She could challenge it. She would not promise the outcome, but the probability of meaningful enforcement was low, and Petra uses the word low only when her analysis justifies it. Then she said the thing I wrote down on the legal pad she had given me when we worked together the first time. She said the provision covered solicitation of the firm's existing clients. It did not prevent a client from independently choosing to leave the firm and seek services elsewhere on their own initiative. A client who terminated their relationship with Holt Strategic Partners and then reached out to me without being asked was not a solicited client. I wrote, "Client-initiated contact. Unsolicited." I put the legal pad in my desk at home and went back to work. February came. The small signals continued steady and accumulating. The quarterly all-hands catering cut back. 2 open positions removed from the jobs page without any announcement. A project management software subscription the firm had renewed every year not renewed. These were the signs of an organization preparing to be smaller, not larger. By the middle of February I had done the account math. 8 accounts. 42% of revenue. I had done it not for any strategic purpose but because I had started to understand that knowing my own value was going to matter soon in a way it had not mattered before in quite the same form. I had also done a different kind of math, one I had not shared with anyone. I had gone back through 3 years of project documentation and mapped every major work product to its author. Every brief, every strategy document, every crisis response, every campaign plan above a certain scope. I did this quietly over 2 weekends using the files I had saved to my personal drive in the normal course of documenting my own work. I was not collecting evidence. I was not preparing a case. I was simply confirming a record that I already knew existed but had never assembled in one place. The record was clear. The work that had built this firm's reputation in the industrial and manufacturing sector was mine. The relationships that sustained the most valuable accounts were mine. The referral network that had brought in new business over the past 2 years ran through connections I had built personally. Marcus had built the firm. I had built the reputation that made it worth acquiring. I did not tell Marcus about either calculation. I did not tell anyone except Petra. March came. The 14th fell on a Tuesday. I want to describe that morning accurately, because the details of it are the kind that do not soften with time. Chicago in the last week before spring breaks honest is a particular color of gray. The flat and non-committal gray of a cold that is not cold enough to be honest and not warm enough to be spring. I drove to the office. I found a parking space on the 3rd level of the garage, which I noted as a minor piece of good luck because 3rd fills first and I had been landing on 5 most of the week. I took the elevator to the 7th floor. The hallway smelled of the overnight cleaning service, faintly chemical and clean. Deb was already at her desk when I came in, which was normal. She was almost always at her desk before me, a fact she attributed to insomnia and I had always attributed to a kind of dedication she was too modest to claim directly. She looked up when I came in and her face was doing the thing it does when she has been waiting for me, and has decided to appear as though she has not been waiting. "Happy birthday," she said. "Thank you," I said. She told me about the lemon filling. Her voice carrying the specific quiet satisfaction of a mission confirmed complete. She said the bakery had not had the lemon that morning, that they had called her by name when she walked in because she came every year, and that they had tracked down the pastry chef who had been on a scheduled day off and confirmed it was being made. That the lemon filling existed on my birthday cake was the result of 3 separate people coordinating across 24 hours. Deb told me this in the same casual tone she uses for everything, as though the effort were obvious and not worth mentioning specifically. I hung my coat and sat down and opened the morning email. A note from the Marchetti Communications director about a press release we had in the pipeline for the acquisition announcement. A contract revision from the healthcare client. 2 vendor invoices routed to me by mistake. The ordinary texture of a Tuesday. Marcus's assistant, Kelly, stopped at my desk at 9:45. She had been with the firm 8 months and had learned to navigate Marcus's daily moods with the practiced skill of someone who survives by accurate reading and minimal footprint. She kept her voice carefully neutral. "Marcus would like to see you," he said, "whenever you have a moment, but sooner rather than later." I finished the paragraph I was writing to the Marchetti Communications director, saved it as a draft, picked up my notebook, the one I always brought into Marcus's office from a habit I had built in the early years when those meetings were substantive enough to warrant notes. I walked down the hall. Kelly did not look up from her screen as I passed her desk. That was the first sign I read correctly in real time rather than in hindsight. Marcus's office had glass on 2 sides. You could see him before you reached the door. He was standing at the window when I came in, the river behind him, his jacket on at 9:45 when he was usually in shirt sleeves by 9. He turned when the door opened. "Sit down," he said. "Even prepared." I sat. I put the notebook on the cushion beside me because I understood already that I was not going to need it. He sat across from me, both hands flat on the desk, the posture of a man who has coached himself toward the appearance of steadiness. He said the firm was entering a new phase of its development. He said a structural review had identified several positions whose scope had evolved in ways that were difficult to sustain in the current model. He said my position had been reviewed and eliminated. He said it the way you say something that has been rehearsed past the point where the words maintain their original weight. I listened. I did not interrupt. I had developed that quality of listening in client meetings where something had gone badly wrong, and the most useful thing I could do was hold full reception until I had all of it before I responded. I used it now because I wanted every word correctly. I wanted the version I kept to be accurate. 12 weeks of severance. The firm would serve as a reference. A 30-day transition period to hand off my accounts to appropriate team members. 30 days. He believed I would spend 30 days handing off my accounts to people who would then hold them. Then, near the end, in that same even and prepared voice, the existing non-compete agreement remained in effect. His understanding was that the scope of the agreement would prevent me from approaching the firm's clients in a competing capacity for the duration of the term. He wanted me to be aware of that so there would be no misunderstanding going forward. He said this to me, in front of a river view, on my 35th birthday, while the birthday cake with the lemon filling sat 2 doors down the hall. I looked at him, and I want to be accurate about what I felt. I was not shaking. I was not blank. What I felt was the thing I have since come to recognize as my particular version of grief, a specific quiet that settles behind the sternum, cold and dense, like a stone finding the bottom of water slowly. I had worked for this man for 7 years. I had built the actual foundation of this firm's reputation with the same patient and specific attention I had been developing since I was an account coordinator eating cold soup air in an open floor plan in my mid-20s. I had sat in presentation rooms and watched him explain my analysis to clients in his voice and had nodded as though the thinking had originated spontaneously in the room. I had answered calls before dawn and worked past 9 and produced strategies and crisis responses in brief after brief, and I had done it because the work was worth doing well, and because I had told myself that the work was enough, that the work being good was what mattered. And I understood in that moment, sitting in that chair in front of him, in the particular way you understand something you have been circling for a long time without looking at its center directly, that the work had been exactly enough. That it had been precisely what was needed to build a reputation good enough to sell to Meridian Group. That Marcus had always known the value of what I was doing. He had simply never believed he was obligated to share the value he knew was there. There was one more thing I noticed in that quiet. He had not thanked me. Not for the 7 years, not for the Marchetti account, not for the Indiana announcement or the regulatory inquiry or the 8 weeks ahead of schedule on the repositioning. The meeting had begun and it was ending, and the word thank you had not appeared once in anything he said. I did not expect it. But I noticed it with the precision of someone who had been paying attention to that particular absence for a long time. I said, "Thank you for telling me." He looked slightly surprised. He had prepared for something other than that. I stood, picked up the notebook, said I would be in touch through the appropriate channels about the transition logistics, in the voice I use when something has gone wrong in a client meeting and the only productive thing is to stay composed until I am somewhere I can afford not to be. I walked back down the hall. Kelly did not look up as I passed. Deb's desk was empty, she had a 10 o'clock call. I went into my own office and sat for 3 minutes looking at the east-facing window, and the gray late-winter sky past it, and the distant flat line where the city met the lake. Then I picked up my phone and called Petra Osei. She answered on the second ring. "I need to talk today if possible," I said. A short pause. "What happened?" "They let me go this morning." And before I left the office he reminded me about the non-compete. A longer pause, quiet and gathering itself. "Come to my office at noon. Don't sign anything before you get here." I said I wouldn't. I sat for one more moment. Through the glass partition between my office and the corridor, I could see the break room door. The birthday cake was behind it. Deb had ordered lemon filling because I had mentioned once, 2 years ago in a conversation I barely remembered having, that lemon filling was the one birthday cake improvement worth discussing. I picked up my bag, left the notebook on the desk, walked out through the open floor plan toward the elevator without stopping, and did not look back at the break room as I passed it. The lobby of the building was full of the ordinary late-morning traffic of a downtown office tower. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now let's get back to the story. People moving through with coffee and earphones and the focused unseeing of people in transit. I moved through it the way you move through something when you are part of it but not inside it anymore. Just a woman with a bag on a Tuesday in March going wherever she was going. My car was on the 3rd level of the garage. I drove to the West Loop. I parked 2 blocks from Petra's building and sat in the car for 11 minutes before I went in. Not because I was composing myself, I was composed. Because I was thinking. I was thinking about the non-compete and what Petra had said in January. I was thinking about the 30-day transition window Marcus had offered, which was in fact an offer to let me facilitate the transfer of accounts he believed were transferable, which meant he believed the clients were loyal to the firm and would stay when the relationship was removed. I was thinking about Vincent Jr.'s calls before 8 in the morning, about the healthcare client's communications director, who had sought me out by name after a referral from someone at Marchetti, about the 3 manufacturing accounts that had come through relationships I had built personally, not through the firm's marketing or Marcus's connections. I was thinking about the assumption the entire plan was built on, that the accounts belonged to Holt Strategic Partners, that they would remain with Holt Strategic Partners once I was no longer there, the way furniture remains when a tenant moves out. Marcus had built that assumption from the outside of the relationships rather than the inside of them, from the firm's name on the proposals and his handshake at the quarterly reviews. He had never stood inside a 7 a.m. phone call from a client who needed the truth and had learned to call one specific number to get it. He did not know what he was about to find out. He was going to find it out anyway. I got out of the car. Petra was already in her small conference room when I arrived. Yellow legal pad in front of her, pen in hand, the expression she uses when she has been thinking since the phone call and is ready to begin. She pushed a bottle of water across the table. "Tell me exactly what he said," she said. "Every word you remember." I told her all of it in the order it happened. She wrote steadily, not fast but without stopping. When I finished, she looked at her notes for a long moment. "The non-compete," she said. "Did he give you any written documentation today?" "Nothing yet. He said documentation was coming." I told him I had not signed anything. "Good. That was the right call." She pulled my employment agreement from the folder she had prepared, turned to the non-compete section, tapped the relevant paragraphs with her pen. She said what she had said in January with more precision and more certainty, now that the facts were on the table in front of both of us. The provision was enforceable on its face and vulnerable in 2 distinct places. My salary exceeded the threshold where Illinois law required additional consideration at signing, and the firm had not provided it. There were also grounds to argue the scope was overbroad. She could challenge it. She would not promise the outcome. But the probability of meaningful enforcement, of the kind of enforcement that would actually prevent me from working in my field, was low. Then she said the thing I had written down on the legal pad in January. "The provision applies to solicitation of the firm's existing clients," she said. "It does not prevent a client from independently choosing to leave the firm and seeking services elsewhere on their own initiative. A client who terminates their relationship with Holt Strategic Partners and then reaches out to you without being asked is not a solicited client. Client-initiated contact, I said. She looked at me steadily. Exactly. She asked what I wanted to do. I thought about it. Not for performance. Because the question deserved the accurate answer, and not the first answer that presented itself. I want to build my own firm, I said. I have been thinking about it for a long time. Not as a contingency plan. As a direction. The firing changes the timing. It does not change the direction. She looked at me with the small adjustment of expression she uses when she is revising her read of a situation. She set down her pen. Then we start with the structure, she said. And while we talk, I am going to draft the response to whatever separation agreement they send. Everything goes through this office in writing. We do not sign the non-compete acknowledgement as currently written. She drafted a response framework on the yellow legal pad as we talked, block letters, her shorthand, a language I had learned to partially read over 3 years. She outlined 3 things we needed before I could operate freely. First, a formal written response to the separation agreement disputing the non-compete scope and requesting corrected consideration. Second, documentation of my independent client relationships, any emails, call logs, agreements that predated the firm's involvement and demonstrated that certain relationships existed prior to or independent of the firm's work. Third, the formation documents for the new entity, which she could not draft for me but could review. She said one more thing before I left. She said that the 30-day transition window Marcus had proposed was not in my interest. She said I should negotiate it down to 2 weeks, cite the personal circumstances of a sudden termination, and use the 2 weeks not to hand off accounts but to ensure my own records were complete and that nothing proprietary was left behind in my departure. She said the word proprietary with a specific emphasis that told me she meant it in both directions. We were in that conference room for 2 hours. When I left, I had the bones of something. Not a finished plan, not the comprehensive version, but the structure that the rest could be built on. The frame. I went home to my apartment in Lincoln Square. Made tea. Sat at the kitchen table with the north-facing windows letting in the flat gray afternoon light. I called my mother at 4 o'clock. She lives in Columbus still, in the same house on Greenlawn Avenue, tending the same garden with the same patient attention she has always given to things worth keeping. She answered on the second ring. I told her all of it. Not the managed version, not the one shaped to protect her from worrying, but the real one because she has always been the person I tell the real version to. She listened the way she listens, with full attention and without filling the space. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she asked, "Did you eat anything today?" "No," I said. "First thing," she said. Then she asked what my attorney had said. I gave her the main points. She listened to those the same way. Then she said what she has said to me a few times in my life at the moments when the direction shifts and what I need is not comfort but calibration. She said, "You know what you're doing, Clara. You always have. This just means you're doing it somewhere else now." It was not the most complex thing anyone had ever said to me. But she had watched me for 35 years and she had made an accurate assessment rather than a hopeful one. And that distinction was what made it settle the way it did. I stayed at the kitchen table after I hung up. The light changed in the windows as the afternoon moved toward evening, the gray thinning in the way late winter gray thins when the season is finally deciding. I thought about the 7 years. Not with grief or not only with grief. With the kind of attention I give to things I want to understand accurately rather than emotionally. I thought about the work, the accounts, the relationships that were real rather than institutional. The 7 a.m. calls from a client who had learned that one specific number was the number to call when the truth was needed. The 3 referrals that had come through people who trusted me personally. Not the firm's name on an email. The 42%. I thought about what Marcus had believed when he made his plan. That the accounts were the firm's. That they would stay with the firm when the relationship was removed, the way water stays in a glass when you change the glass. He had never stood inside those relationships. He had stood at the front of the room and shaken the hands and accepted the warmth that clients extend to whoever they believe is responsible, and he had never asked why the results were what they were, or what the actual mechanism of retention looked like from the inside. He had built the plan on that assumption. The assumption was wrong in the specific way that confident people's assumptions tend to be wrong, which is that they mistake the conditions that allow other people's work to happen for the source of the work itself. I also thought about the timing. He had fired me on my birthday. I had spent most of the afternoon telling myself it was probably coincidental, a product of the acquisition timeline and the separation process and the date things needed to happen to align with whatever meridian required for the transition. That was possible. That was probably true. But somewhere near the back of my mind I also thought about the specific quality of indifference required to look at a calendar, see the date, and proceed anyway. It was not cruelty, probably. It was something I found in some ways harder, which was that it had not registered as relevant. That the date had not risen to the level of consideration. That told me something about how I had been seen. And knowing it, having it confirmed that specifically, made what I was about to do easier in a way I had not anticipated. I opened my laptop. I opened a new document. I typed 2 words at the top. Reeve Strategy. I looked at them. They felt correct in the structural sense. The sense of a joint properly seated. Not the name of an aspiration. The name of a thing. Then I began to write. Not a business plan, not yet. A list of what I knew to be true. The accounts. The relationships and the specific nature of the trust that held them, where it had been built and why it held under pressure. The work that had been made invisible by the structure it operated inside, and was about to become visible because the structure had just removed itself. The 42%. The 7 a.m. calls. The referrals. The names. I wrote down Vincent Marchetti Jr.'s name. I wrote down the names of the contacts at each of the 3 manufacturing clients. I wrote down the healthcare client's communications director, who had sought me out specifically. I wrote down the names of the people at each firm I had worked with directly over years, the people who knew my number and had used it. I did not write a single name with any intention of calling them. Petra had been clear. I wrote them because the list was a record, not a plan. A record of what was real. What had been built. What could not be undone by 12 weeks of severance and a non-compete with a flaw in the consideration clause. I also wrote down one thing that was not a name. I wrote down, he did not thank me. Not once in that room. I wrote it not with bitterness or not only with bitterness, but because I wanted to remember it accurately. Because a person who does not thank you for 7 years of work is a person who has always planned to account for it this way, as a line item that simply ends. And a line item that simply ends can become something else. I wrote until 10 o'clock. When I stopped, the list had become the beginning of a strategy. The bones of something that was mine. I saved the document and closed the laptop and went to bed on my 35th birthday. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel relief exactly. I felt something with a similar temperature to relief, the feeling of a door that has been latched from the outside for a very long time standing open, and the cold air coming through and the cold air being for the first time entirely mine to walk into. The separation agreement arrived in Petra's email inbox on the Thursday after the firing, which meant Marcus had moved on it faster than I had expected, which meant the Meridian timeline was already pressing his side of the table. Petra called me at 8 in the morning and read me the relevant paragraphs in the flat tone she uses when she is translating legal language into what it actually means for a specific person's life. The severance was as stated. 12 weeks at my current salary paid in a lump sum. Standard reference language. The standard non-disclosure of proprietary firm information. And Exhibit A, which was the non-compete acknowledgement Marcus had mentioned in the room, and which asked me to confirm in writing that I understood the full 2-year, 50-mile scope and would not approach any current active Holt client in a competing capacity for that duration. Petra read the Exhibit A language with a specific quality of patience, the kind that a person develops when they have read many documents written by people who believe that the act of writing something with sufficient authority makes it so. He signed a lump sum severance without requiring installments, she said. That tells me he wants this closed quickly. I asked what she intended to do. She said she was going to respond with a letter identifying the consideration defect in the original agreement, disputing the scope as overbroad under current Illinois standards, and proposing a modified provision that she believed both sides could live with. She said she expected pushback. She said the pushback would tell her how much he needed this to close and therefore how much leverage she had. She said, "Don't sign anything. Don't contact anyone. Let me work." I said I wouldn't. I went back to my kitchen table and the Reeve strategy document on my laptop and I kept building. The document had been open since the night of my birthday and had grown every day since. It was beginning to feel less like a plan and more like a firm, which are different things. A plan is what you intend to do, and a firm is what you are already doing, And the line between them is not a moment of decision but a gradual accumulation of specific small actions that pass the threshold without announcing it. If you have ever done the right work in the wrong building, this is the part where we find out what the work was actually worth all along. Welcome back to Tales of a Wandering Wolf. Drop a comment and stay with me because the calls that come in the next few weeks are the kind that cannot be scripted, and the people making them are about to say things that Marcus Holt did not plan for. The first week after the firing had the specific suspended quality of a period between things. I was technically still on the 30-day transition notice, which meant I was still drawing a salary from Holt and was nominally expected to participate in a handoff process. In practice, Marcus had not scheduled any handoff meetings, his assistant had not reached out, and the only communication I received from the firm was through Petra, who was now the designated channel for all contact. This was not an accident. He had wanted a clean cut and had structured the transition accordingly, which meant the 30-day period was largely a formality he intended to pay out without using. I used those days differently. I registered the LLC for Reeve Strategy with the state of Illinois using a filing service, which took 48 hours and cost less than I expected. I opened a business checking account. I set up a professional email domain. I converted the second bedroom in my Lincoln Square apartment, the one I had been using as a home office since I moved in, into a proper working space, a desk I had always worked at anyway, bookshelves I reorganized toward usefulness rather than aesthetics, a printer, a whiteboard I bought from the office supply store 2 blocks away, and mounted myself on a Saturday morning with a drill I had owned since the framing days and never quite stopped owning. The whiteboard was the thing that made the space feel real. I stood in front of it the first morning it was up and wrote 2 words on it in blue marker. Reeve Strategy. Then I listed the things that needed to happen in the next 30 days. Then I stepped back and looked at the list and understood that I had been building toward this for years without naming it, and that the only reason I had not done it sooner was that I had convinced myself the structure I was inside was the structure that allowed the work to happen rather than the structure that contained and credited someone else for the work I was already doing. The structure was gone. The work remained. Those 2 weeks of the notice period were the most productive 2 weeks I had spent in the previous 2 years, because they were the first 2 weeks in which all the time I spent was mine. No internal meetings scheduled to give the appearance of alignment. No status updates to write for Marcus's review before they went to clients. A process that added a layer of delay and removed a layer of directness from every client communication. No navigating around the project management system that added 4 weeks to every engagement. Just the work in the order and method it needed to be done. I built the service framework over 3 days. It was not complicated because I had been doing the actual work for 7 years and knew what it required. The work required sustained presence in the client's world, meaning consistent research and regular contact, not just the contact generated by deliverables. It required honest analysis rather than the kind of analysis designed to validate decisions the client had already made and wanted confirmed. It required an account manager who was also the strategic lead, because the split between those 2 roles is where most agency work loses its coherence. You cannot build a communication strategy for a company whose market you are not inside, and you cannot stay inside a market by attending quarterly reviews and reading the briefs your junior staff produces. You have to do the reading yourself. You have to take the call yourself. The Reeve Strategy Service Scope came out at 1 page. 1 page because the second page was always where the inflation happened, where firms padded the offering with language about proprietary methodologies and cross-functional integration and other constructions that took up space without saying anything. The 1 page said what I did, how I did it, and what it cost. I kept that page on my desk throughout the notice period and looked at it occasionally with the feeling of a person who has finally written the actual version of something they have been translating through someone else's language for a long time. I also used those 2 weeks to reach out to 3 vendors I had worked with over the years who provided specific research and analytics support that I would need. A media monitoring service whose account rep I had dealt with directly for 4 years and who said, when I called and told her what I was building, that she had wondered when I was going to do exactly this. A legal communications specialist in Washington whose work I had used twice during the Marchetti regulatory inquiry, and who told me that if I was starting my own shop, he would be glad to have a preferred referral relationship. A content strategy consultant in Indianapolis whose name I had given to 3 separate clients over the years, and who now returned the favor directly by saying, "Tell me when you're ready and I'll route work to you." The network was already there. I had been building it for years in the same way and with the same patient-specific attention I had applied to everything. I just had not built the structure that would let me use it as mine. Now I had the structure. Deb came over on the Saturday after the firing. She brought food because that is what Deb does when something has happened. She brings food in containers and she does not ask if it is okay to come. She sends a text at 9 a.m. that says I am coming over at noon with the particular combination of warmth and decisiveness that makes the offer impossible to deflect even if you wanted to, which I did not. She brought soup from the Vietnamese place and a small bottle of wine she said was for after the soup, and she sat at my kitchen table and looked at me the way she looks at things she is trying to understand accurately. She told me the office had gone quiet in the specific way places go quiet when everyone knows something has shifted but no one is saying so out loud. That 3 separate people had asked her in the first 2 days whether they should call me. That she had told each of them to wait. That she was not certain yet of what my situation was. I appreciated that. The waiting. She asked me what was happening, not what had happened, the present tense deliberate. I told her the main structure, the firm Petra, the modification Petra was seeking, the plan I was building. I was careful about what I said. Not because I did not trust Deb, I trusted Deb more than anyone in that building, but because the careful version was the right version for both of us. I did not want her positioned in a way that created complications for her. She listened without interrupting, which for Deb takes effort and represents genuine respect for the gravity of a conversation. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You always knew the accounts were yours." I said, "I always knew the relationships were mine. The accounts were theirs." She shook her head slowly. She said, "Not anymore. We ate the soup. We opened the wine after. We did not talk about the firm or Marcus or the acquisition for the rest of the afternoon. We talked about other things, the way friends talk when they have handled the serious conversation and have earned the ordinary one, and it was a good afternoon in the specific way that good afternoons are when everything around them is uncertain." Before she left, Deb said one thing that I did not entirely expect. She said she had been at Holt for 6 years, and that in 6 years she had never once heard Marcus ask a client how something was going for them personally. She had heard him ask about the company, the quarter, the competitive environment. But the person never. She said, "You always asked. Every single call. You asked about the thing before the agenda." She shook her head once, not with sentiment but with the look of someone who has just finished identifying the variable that explains the whole dataset. She said, "That was why they called you." She picked up her bag and went home. I sat with that for a while. It was a small thing to name and a large thing to be. The question before the agenda. The thing before the agenda was not small talk. It was the signal that the relationship was a relationship rather than a transaction, and relationships do not transfer in separation agreements. In the second week, Petra's letter went to Holt's employment attorney. I did not see the specific language she used, but she described it to me on the phone as firm and specific and designed to make one thing clear, that the non-compete as written had a documented enforceability problem that would require expensive litigation to pursue, and that if Marcus wanted the separation to close quietly and quickly, he had a better path available. Holt's attorney pushed back on the consideration argument, which Petra had expected. She said their response suggested the attorney was working from the position that Marcus wanted the full provision enforced, and was willing to litigate. She said that was a bluff and that she would call it. The negotiation went back and forth for 11 days. It occupied a portion of my attention but not all of it. The rest of my attention was on the Reeves strategy document, which had grown from a list into an actual plan. A service scope. A pricing model. A list of the specific industries and client profiles I understood best. A one-page description of the firm's approach to client work that I rewrote 3 times because the first 2 versions were competent and the third one was true. The third one said that the most important thing a communications strategy firm can do is tell its clients things they already know but have not yet said, and that doing that requires sustained presence rather than periodic performance. I read that sentence every morning for a week. It was a description of what I had always done. Saying it plainly, under my own name, in a document that belonged to me rather than to the firm that had employed me, was the kind of simple thing that shouldn't feel as significant as it did. But it did. I sent the third version to Petra. She read it and called me back and said, "This is what you have always done." I said, "I know." She said, "Good." 11 days after the firing, on a Wednesday morning in mid-March, my phone rang with a number I did not immediately recognize. Then I recognized it. The Detroit main line for Marchetti Group's executive suite. I sat with the phone in my hand for one ring. Then I answered. Vincent Marchetti Jr. spoke first. He said, "I was told there had been a transition." I said, "That's right. I've left the firm." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I was assigned someone named Brian this morning. I had a call with him." I said, "Brian is capable. He's been with the firm 4 years." There was the brief silence that precedes a response that is going to be direct. Then, he did not know about the Coldest discussion. The Coldest discussion was a conversation I had had with Vincent Jr. 8 months earlier about a potential acquisition target in the specialty manufacturing segment, a company called Coldest Industrial out of Toledo that he had been watching for 2 years, and that had not yet come to market. We had spent 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon talking through the communications implications of that acquisition if it materialized, the investor story, the employee messaging, the regional customer reassurance that would need to happen in the first 90 days. It was a conversation that existed nowhere in any Holt document. It lived in my notes and in the understanding we had built across 4 years of the actual work. Brian would not have known about the Coldest discussion because it had never been reported up. It was the kind of conversation that did not require a status update to Marcus because it was part of the ongoing strategic thinking that the account work was built on, and Marcus had never asked to be included in those conversations because he had not known they were happening. I said no, he wouldn't know about that one. Another silence. Then Vincent Jr. said, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and is confirming rather than asking, "You're going to start something of your own." I said, "I'm in the process of establishing an independent practice." He said, "When you have something to send me." I said, "I'll let you know." He said, "Good." And he hung up, because Vincent Jr. does not extend conversations past the point of their purpose. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone face down in front of me, and the whiteboard on the wall behind me with Reeves' strategy written across the top in blue marker, and I felt the specific weight of that call settle into the room. He had not asked me to come back. He had not made a promise. He had done what Vincent Jr. always does, which is to communicate precisely what he means and no more. When you have something to send me was not a question. It was a statement about what would happen next. I picked up a pen and I wrote the date on the legal pad in front of me. Then I wrote VMJ called. Then I sat with that for a moment before I allowed myself to understand what it meant. What it meant was that the assumption the entire Meridian deal was built on had just been tested by someone who understood what he was buying and had decided, in the 11 days since I had left the firm, that Brian was not the product. I was the product. The firm had been the envelope. What was inside the envelope had not stayed with the envelope. Marcus believed he had bought 12 weeks of my time and the rest of the book. He had bought 12 weeks of my time and nothing else. I thought about the call Marcus had presumably received from his new account lead. Brian reporting the Marchetti conversation, or rather reporting the absence of the Marchetti conversation, the gap where the institutional knowledge should have been. Marcus assigning the gap to the client rather than to the structure. Telling himself that Vincent Jr. was difficult, which was true and which was not the issue. Not seeing or not being able to afford to see that what he had classified as difficulty was in fact discernment. The clients I had worked with for years were not loyal to the work because it was good work in the abstract. They were loyal to the work because the work had been built on actual understanding of their specific situations, their specific challenges, the specific way their CEOs thought about problems. That understanding did not transfer in a handoff meeting. It did not live in a project management system. It was the accumulation of 100 phone calls and 300 emails and every conversation that had happened at the end of an agenda when the rest of the people had dropped off and it was just 2 people talking about what was actually going on. Brian had not been on those calls. Brian would never catch up, not in the time available. And Vincent Jr. had known that within 5 minutes of the first conversation. I looked at the phone for a moment longer. Then I wrote Coldest on the legal pad, circled it, and went back to the Reeves strategy document. The call from Valerie Cho came 4 days later on a Sunday morning. Valerie was the communications director at the Midwest Healthcare System, a regional network of 4 hospitals and 18 outpatient facilities that had been a Holt client for 2 years and that had come to me, specifically to me, through a referral from someone at Marchetti Group who had told Valerie that if she needed someone who would actually read her industry and tell her things she had not already heard, she should call Clara Reeves. Valerie was careful on the call. She had a precise and legalistic quality of mind that I had always found useful, because it meant the conversations we had were stripped of the softening that makes a lot of agency-client communication comfortable and useless simultaneously. She said, "I have been told by Holt that you have departed. I want to confirm that information." I confirmed it. She said, "Are you in a position to discuss the nature of your departure, or are you in a restricted period?" I said, "I am in a restricted period through the completion of a separation agreement. My attorney is finalizing the terms. I expect to have clarity on my full status within a short time." She said, "When that changes, please have your attorney contact our office directly." And then she said one more thing in the same careful professional tone. "I would like you to know that I did not come to Holt Strategic Partners. I came to you. That has always been the nature of this relationship." I said, "I understand. I appreciate you telling me." She said, "I wanted it on record." She hung up. I wrote Valerie Cho on the legal pad. Then I wrote MH. Then I sat for a moment with the two names on the page, VMJ and MHS, and the quiet that had settled into my apartment on that Sunday morning, and I thought about the word record that Valerie had used. I would like it on record. She was a communications professional. She had used that word knowing what it meant and wanting me to know she knew. The separation agreement was finalized on the following Wednesday. Petra called me at 9 in the morning with the terms. The non-compete was modified to direct solicitation of active Holt clients only, no geographic restriction, and 12 months rather than 24. The consideration defect was resolved by the firm's agreement to add an additional 4 weeks of severance, bringing the total to 16 weeks. Petra said the additional payment was tacit admission of the original flaw, which she was pleased about. I signed that afternoon. On Thursday morning I sent Valerie Cho's assistant a brief email through my new Reeves Strategy address with a one-line note. "Terms finalized as of Wednesday. Happy to speak at your convenience. Claire Reeves. Reeves Strategy LLC." Valerie called at 10. We spoke for 25 minutes. She described the current state of the Midwest healthcare system's communications work as being in a holding pattern following my departure, and said the system had not authorized Holt to begin any new campaigns. She asked about availability and scope. I told her I was building a boutique practice and could take on a small number of founding clients with the intention of providing the kind of sustained strategic attention that she had originally sought, and that I intended to be the firm's primary offering. She asked what that meant in practical terms. I said it meant that the account manager and the strategic lead were the same person, that the person who answered the phone was the person who wrote the brief, that the client would not be rotated through a staffing model designed around billable hours. She asked about pricing. I gave her a number that was higher than what Holt had charged. She did not blink, which told me something about the value she had placed on the relationship versus the value that had been formalized in previous invoices. She said, "Send me a scope document by end of week." I sent it Thursday afternoon, 6 hours after the call. She returned a signed letter of engagement on Friday morning. That was Reeves Strategy's first official client. The date was in the last week of March, 13 days after my 35th birthday. Vincent Marchetti Jr.'s formal engagement followed 8 days later. He came from Detroit to Chicago for the meeting, which I had suggested could be a call but which he had said, in exactly this way, would not be a call. We met in a private conference room I had booked at a business hotel in the Loop for 2 hours. He did not bring a deputy or an attorney. He sat across from me with a notepad and a pen and the focused attention he gives to the conversations he considers worth having. I presented the scope of engagement on a single sheet of paper. 1 page, no deck, because a deck is a performance in Vincent Jr. and I had been past performances for 4 years. The scope described what I would do and at what frequency and for what monthly retainer. The retainer was higher than what Holt had charged, substantially higher, because Holt had been charging for a team of 4 on the account and what was actually being delivered was 1 person working at a level that required no team. He read the page. He asked 1 question, about my conflict of interest policy for any future clients in the industrial supply sector. I told him the policy. He wrote something on his notepad. Then he said, "I want to tell you something." His voice had a different register than usual, less clipped, more deliberate. He said, "When my father handed me the company, he told me one thing. He said the relationships that matter are the ones where the other person tells you something true when a lie would have been easier. He said those people are rare, and that when you find one you don't lose them over a contract cycle. I looked at him across the conference table. He was not a sentimental man. He was a man who said things once and meant them precisely. I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "I'm not telling you for appreciation. I'm telling you so you know that this is not just a client relationship to me. It is a considered business decision. The Fortis acquisition is now 18 months from closing if the current signals are right. I want the communication strategy for that built from day one with someone who understands the history." He signed the letter of intent on the spot. By the first week of April, Reeves Strategy had 3 active client engagements: Marchetti Group, the Midwest healthcare system, and a mid-size precision manufacturing firm in Rockford called Halloway Components, whose operations director had called me directly 10 days after I left Holt. He said his firm had been a Holt client for 3 years and had renewed the engagement twice because of my work specifically, and that the moment he had heard I was no longer at the firm he had asked his CEO to pause the upcoming renewal. He said he was calling to ask what my situation was. I told him. He said, "When can you meet?" We met the following week at their Rockford facility, which I had visited once before, and which had the quality of a place that had been built slowly and was proud of that. Sandra Park, the CEO, had a quality I recognized from the first 5 minutes. The quality of a person who has heard a lot of presentations and is waiting to hear what you actually think rather than what you have prepared. I told her what I actually thought about their communications positioning, which was that the firm's strongest story was its production consistency and its client retention record, and that neither of those things appeared prominently in their current external communications, which led with technology claims that their competitors were also making and that meant nothing in differentiation terms. She wrote 2 things down. She asked 3 questions. She said nothing that was not directly relevant to the discussion. Reeves Strategy had its 3rd client the following Friday. 3 clients in 2 weeks. None of them solicited. All of them calling a number they had been calling for years, and finding it had moved to a different building. I want to tell you what was happening at Holt Strategic Partners during those same 2 weeks, which I know because Deb was still there, and Deb is, among her many qualities, one of the most accurate observers of organizational dynamics I have ever known. The Marchetti termination letter arrived at Holt on the Tuesday after Vincent Jr. and I had our meeting. It was formal, 2 paragraphs, citing the change in account leadership as the reason for non-renewal and thanking the firm for its years of service. It was addressed to Marcus Holt personally. Brad Tillis received it first because Brad Tillis received everything that touched the firm's financial position first, and he walked it to Marcus's office that Tuesday afternoon and closed the door. Deb had a sightline to Marcus's office from her desk. She told me about it 2 days later at a coffee shop near my apartment, one she had suggested and which was far enough from the loop that the odds of running into anyone from Holt were low. She had texted me at 8 in the morning and said, "I think you should hear some things." She told me about the door. She told me about the 40 minutes Marcus and Brad had been in the office together and the quality of quiet that came from behind the glass, the kind that has no movement in it, no shifting energy, the stillness of 2 people reading the same terrible number on the same page. She told me that Marcus had come out of that meeting with a look on his face that she had never seen in 7 years, not quite anger, not quite fear, but something underneath both of them, the look of a man who has built a plan around a premise and has discovered the premise was wrong. She said he had called a meeting of the senior account team that afternoon. All remaining account leads. She said she had attended. She said Marcus had spoken about the Marchetti departure in very general terms, citing a change in the client's strategic direction, which was not what the termination letter had said and which the account leads in that room understood was not the real reason because most of them had worked with Marchetti Group's team at some level and knew the relationship had not been with the firm. She said no one challenged him. That the meeting lasted 12 minutes. That 2 of the junior account coordinators had looked at each other during the meeting in the specific way of people who are realizing they have been given information that does not match the information they already have. She said one more thing about that meeting. She said that Marcus had used the phrase strategic transition 4 times in 12 minutes, and that each time he used it his voice had the quality of a man pressing on something to test whether it was still solid under his weight. She said it did not sound solid. I asked her how Brad Tillis had looked in the meeting. She said, Brad Tillis was not in the meeting. I thought about that. Brad Tillis not in the room when Marcus was managing the narrative to his team meant that Brad and Marcus were not aligned on what the narrative was. That Brad was in a separate conversation, probably with the Meridian attorneys, running a different set of numbers. The kind of numbers that told you what happens to a revenue multiple when the three largest accounts on the books have each sent formal termination notices inside a 30-day window. 3. I confirmed with her. Had there been 3 terminations by then? She said. As of this morning, yes. I had known about the Marchetti letter and the Midwest healthcare system. The third was from Holloway Components, which had terminated the Holt engagement formally on the same day Sandra Park and I had signed our letter of intent. Sandra Park did not waste motion. 3 of the 8 accounts I had been managing, gone from Holt's books in the first 3 weeks after my departure. The 3 largest by revenue of the 8, roughly a third of the firm's total billings, transferred out of the Meridian Acquisitions revenue base and into the accounts receivable of a 2-month-old LLC in Lincoln Square. I looked at the window in the gray April morning that was finally starting to think about spring, and I thought about the Meridian deal. The Meridian Group acquisition had almost certainly been priced against a revenue multiple. Their model was consistent across previous acquisitions, which were public record if you knew what to look for. They bought firms at a multiple of recurring annual billings, typically between 8 and 12 times, depending on client retention history, account stability, and growth profile. For Holt Strategic Partners, the quality of the client book had been built on the Marchetti relationship and the cluster of accounts around it. Those accounts had been assessed by Meridian's due diligence team as stable and likely to renew. They would have been assessed that way because that was how they appeared on the books, as multi-year client relationships with consistent billing histories and positive renewal patterns. The assessors had not known what I knew, that the stability was relational, not structural, that it lived in one person's specific and sustained presence in those relationships and nowhere else, that the person had left the building, which meant Meridian was in the process of acquiring a company whose revenue base had changed materially from the moment I had walked out of the elevator and into the parking garage. The revenue multiple was being applied to a number that was declining by the week. Whether Marcus had disclosed the account departures to Meridian, which he was legally obligated to do if they were material to the deal, I did not know. Whether Meridian had received the updated numbers was a question I also could not answer from where I sat. What I could answer was simpler. The revenue was no longer at Holt. It was with me. And the most valuable thing Marcus had believed he was selling to Meridian was sitting in a 2-month-old LLC on a whiteboard in Lincoln Square. Then Deb told me the thing she had really come to say. She said that in the past week she had been noticing something. That several clients she managed had asked, in different ways and in different conversations, whether Clara Reeves was still with the firm or had moved to a different role. She said she had answered honestly that I was no longer at Holt, that she didn't have information about my plans, and that each time she said this the client had gone quiet in the particular way of a person who has gotten the answer they expected and is now deciding what to do with it. She told me this clearly and carefully, not as reporting, not as intelligence, but as a friend who was watching something happen and wanted me to have the full picture. I asked her directly, "Are you telling me you're thinking about leaving?" She looked at her coffee. Then she looked at me. She said, "I am telling you that I have been at Holt for 6 years and that I am not certain the firm I joined 6 years ago is the same entity I am working for now. And I am telling you that the way I do this work, which is the same way you do this work, may not be the way this work is going to be done in the structure that comes after the Meridian deal closes." She said it carefully, not as a resignation, not as a demand, but as a person who had been thinking clearly about her own situation and was ready to say what she had been thinking. I said, "If you ever want to have that conversation formally, I am ready to have it." She nodded once. She picked up her coffee. We talked about other things for a few minutes and then she went back to the Loop and I went back to Lincoln Square. And I understood from the quality of that conversation that Deb was going to leave Holt and that when she did she would call me and that the firm I was building would be better for having her in it than for not having her. I also understood something else. I understood that the accounts I had taken with me represented a significant and specific reduction in the revenue multiple that the Meridian acquisition was predicated on. Marchetti alone had been substantial. The healthcare system, the Holloway engagement, the referral pipeline that ran through those accounts, all of it was gone from Holt's books. The Meridian deal, if it was in the valuation stage, had been priced against a book that no longer existed. I thought about Brad Tillis and the expression on his face behind the glass wall of that conference room. I thought about the specific quality of miscalculation required to fire someone on their birthday without registering the date, and then believe that the accounts they had built over 7 years with calls that started before 8 in the morning and conversations about acquisition targets that were never written up in a status report would transfer neatly to a mid-level manager named Brian because the firm's name was on the retainer contract. I was not angry about it. Or I was, in the small persistent way of someone who has been underestimated specifically and clearly, but the anger was not the primary thing. The primary thing was a feeling I am still not sure I have the right word for. The feeling of a thing being correct. Not pleasant, not triumphant, but accurate. The shape of what was happening matching the shape of what was true. By the middle of April, Reeves Strategy had its fourth client. A referral from Holloway Components to a regional logistics firm that had been looking for communication support for a PE-backed growth initiative. The referral came through Sandra Park's direct recommendation, which meant that Holloway had already decided Reeves Strategy was the kind of firm worth sending people to, which is not a conclusion you reach in the first 3 weeks unless the work in the first 3 weeks is what it is supposed to be. I hired a part-time administrative assistant through a staffing firm, and set up a video conference system in the second bedroom that was now unambiguously an office. I bought a second whiteboard. I printed the Reeves Strategy name and address on business cards that arrived on a Wednesday and that I held for a moment when they came out of the envelope, the way you hold something that is real in a way the digital version of it is not. I kept one on my desk and put the rest in the drawer and went back to the Marchetti brief, which was by now 41 pages and needed to be cut to 22 in the same way it always needed to be cut. By the second week of April, the referrals had started to move. Sandra Park sent the logistics firm. Valerie Cho mentioned my name to 2 of her professional contacts in the regional healthcare space, one of whom called me within 3 days. A manufacturing industry contact I had known for 4 years reached out directly after the Holloway news circulated through the sector through the informal channels that industrial networks use. The calls were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves as what they were. They arrived the way organic referrals always arrive, as a colleague saying I heard you had moved on and wanting to know where. On a Thursday in the third week of April, Deb Kwan sent me a text at 6:30 in the evening that said, "I sent my resignation today. Effective 2 weeks from Friday." Then she sent a second text that said, "I assume we should talk." I called her back in under a minute. We had a conversation that was mostly practical and slightly emotional, the right ratio for both of us. She told me what she wanted from work, which was what she had always wanted, the long kind of client work, the sustained attention, the kind of practice that built real results rather than renewal cycle performances. She said she had been thinking about it for longer than the past month, that she had known for at least a year that the trajectory at Holt, even before the Meridian process, was moving away from the kind of work she wanted to do. That the Meridian deal had simply clarified the timeline. She said one thing that stayed with me. She said, "The problem with working for a firm where one person takes credit for everything is that eventually the thing they are taking credit for leaves. And then what is left is just the credit." I told her what Reeves Strategy was becoming and where I thought it was going. I told her the client list and the revenue trajectory and the growth projections for year 2 and 3, which were conservative and which I believed understated what was possible if the founding client relationships deepened the way they were already deepening. I told her I was building a firm that was structured around the people who did the actual work rather than around the person who stood at the front of the room, and that I intended that distinction to be visible in everything from how we priced our services to how we divided the equity in the firm's growth. She asked what the equity looked like. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is not what agencies offer their employees." I said, "That is because what agencies offer their employees is a version of what Marcus offered us, which is visibility on a good day and replicability on a bad one. That is not what I am building." Another pause. Then she said, "I thought about calling you a week after you left. I talked myself out of it. I told myself I needed to be certain." I said, "What changed?" She said, 3 termination letters in 3 weeks. That's what changed. Not because of the numbers. Because of what the numbers mean. The numbers mean the work was always yours. And I want to work with someone who knows that about their own work. She said yes the same evening. We agreed she would start the Monday after her Holt notice period ended. I put the phone down and stood in front of the whiteboard in my apartment office and looked at what was written there. Reeves Strategy. The client list. The revenue projection for year 1 that I had written conservatively and was already tracking above. The note I had written 6 weeks earlier on the night of my birthday that said, "He did not thank me. Not once in that room." I looked at that note for a moment. Then I erased it. Not because it was not true. Because I was done needing it. The whiteboard had changed since that first night. The two-word title at the top was the same. Below it, the client list now had 4 confirmed names and a 5th in final stages. Below that, 2 columns, work in progress and work completed. The completed column had 11 entries. 11 pieces of actual work in the 6 weeks since the firing, strategy documents, campaign frameworks, crisis briefings, 1 intensive media prep session for Vincent Jr. before a regional industry conference where he was presenting the early signals of the Fortis acquisition. The conference had gone well. He had called me afterward, which he rarely did without a specific purpose, and said, "Good prep." That was the totality of the feedback, which from Vincent Jr. was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I thought about what those 6 weeks had produced versus the 6 weeks before them. Before, meetings about meetings, status updates that summarized documents they had already read, a quarterly review cycle that consumed 40 hours of billable time to produce a presentation Marcus would stand in front of and describe as the firm's analysis. After 11 pieces of work for clients, a 5th incoming, a firm that had been a document and a whiteboard 6 weeks ago, and was now a functioning operation with clients who called on Sunday mornings because they trusted the number they were calling. I had not done this to prove something to Marcus. That distinction mattered to me. I had done it because it was what I had always wanted to do and had been doing anyway, inside a structure that had other people's names on the output. The proof of what it was worth was incidental, but it was also undeniable. By the time Deb's start date arrived, Reeves Strategy had moved from the apartment office to a rented room in a shared office building in River North, 3 blocks from a good coffee shop and 5 minutes from the Loop on the Blue Line. The space was modest, a single room with a shared conference space, a 3-month sublease while I figured out what the growth actually looked like. Deb came in on her first Monday with a small plant for the windowsill and the Vietnamese soup she said was a founding ceremony and the full volume laugh she does when something is exactly right. We had lunch at my desk because there were only 2 chairs and she said the windowsill was fine and that it had a better view anyway. That was the firm at 6 weeks. For confirmed clients, a 5th and final negotiation, 2 people, a whiteboard, a plant on the windowsill, and a brief for an acquisition that had not yet closed but would, and when it did, would be the most significant communications engagement Reeves Strategy had handled to date. 6 weeks after Marcus Holt called me into his office on the morning my birthday cake was in the break room, and told me my position had been eliminated. On a Tuesday morning in the last week of April, my phone rang. I was at my desk with coffee and a draft campaign brief for the Marchetti Fortis acquisition strategy. I looked at the caller ID. Marcus Holt's personal cell phone number. The number I had had in my contacts for 7 years and had used fewer times than I could count on one hand because he was always down the hall. He was not down the hall anymore. I thought about the 30-day transition offer. I thought about the 12 weeks of severance. I thought about the word fair said in a specific tone and the non-compete provision cited before I had even reached the door. I thought about Brian and the Fortis discussion and the 40 minutes Marcus and Brad Tillis had spent behind the glass wall reading the same number. I thought about what this call was going to be about, which I already knew because there was only one thing it could be about now. The phone rang again. I set down the coffee. I looked at the whiteboard. I looked at the brief. I looked at the phone. Then I picked it up. He opened with small talk. That was the first sign. Marcus Holt does not do small talk. He is a man who considers it a kind of professional inefficiency, a view he had expressed more than once over 7 years in exactly those terms when junior staff spent the first 3 minutes of a client call asking about the weekend. He believed in agendas and time efficiency, and the opening line that signals the subject of the meeting. He had the particular impatience of a person who believes their time is worth more per minute than most. So when the call connected and he said, "Clara, I hope you're doing well. How's the new office?" It told me everything before he had said anything that mattered. The small talk was not warmth. It was a man managing a conversation he did not know how to open, filling the first 30 seconds while he found the entrance. I held the phone and looked at the whiteboard and the brief open on my desk. The Marchetti Fortis acquisition strategy in its 3rd full draft, 41 pages now, 32 of them worth keeping, the rest to be cut by noon. I thought about what this call was going to be. I had been thinking about it since the account terminations had started arriving, since the Deb coffee shop conversation, since the moment Brad Tillis had walked into Marcus's office with the Marchetti letter and closed the door. The call had been coming the way a storm comes. You cannot see it yet, but the conditions have been right for weeks. I told him the office was fine. I told him the firm was busy. I said it without adding texture to it, because the texture was not his to have. He said that was good to hear, and his voice had the quality of a person who is not listening to your answer because they are assembling their next sentence while you speak. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the situation, about how things went in March. I want you to know I've had time to reflect on some of the decisions that were made around the transition." The transition. That word covered a firing, a non-compete negotiation, 3 client termination letters, a Meridian due diligence revision, and 42% of a firm's revenue walking out of the building with the person he had fired on her birthday. But he said the transition and I let him use it. I said, "I appreciate that." Then he got to it. He said that in the course of the Meridian process, some complications had arisen with the transition of certain client accounts. He said the Marchetti relationship in particular had presented unexpected challenges. He said Meridian had flagged the account situation in their revised due diligence, and that he was exploring options for how to address it. He said he was reaching out because he believed there was an opportunity for an arrangement that could work for everyone involved. Arrangement. Not partnership. Not collaboration. Arrangement. The word of a man who has not decided yet how much ground he is prepared to give. I said, "What kind of arrangement are you describing?" He paused. The specific pause of a man who had rehearsed this part and was now choosing between the version he had planned and a more direct version that the situation seemed to require. He said, "Meridian would like Reeves Strategy to operate as a preferred vendor partner for the Marchetti account and potentially for several others. The relationship would be formalized through a subcontractor agreement, which would allow the accounts to be classified appropriately in the Meridian portfolio, while preserving the client relationships that have developed." I understood what he was describing in the moment he described it. He wanted the accounts back. Not in the form of an employee relationship, not in the form of an apology or a revision to the original decision, but in the form of a paperwork arrangement that would reclassify the clients under the Holt Meridian umbrella, while paying Reeves Strategy a rate for the service. The clients would be Meridian's clients. The work would be mine. The acquisition multiple would be restored. He was proposing to buy back at a contractor rate what had cost him nothing to keep and what had cost him the deal when he gave it away. I said, "I'll call you back. Give me an hour." I hung up. I picked up the phone and called Petra Osei. Welcome back to Tales of a Wandering Wolf. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, you already understand what that phone call cost Marcus Holt to make. A man who built his professional identity on being the one who makes decisions is calling the person he discarded 6 weeks ago and asking her to save his transaction. That call did not come from strength. It came from the specific corner that certain kinds of confidence back themselves into when the assumption at the center of the confidence turns out to have been wrong. Stay right here. Because what Clara says next is the reason I wanted to tell this story from the very beginning. Petra answered on the second ring. I gave her the full call in the order it happened and she listened without interrupting, and then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He wants the accounts reclassified back under his umbrella. He wants to use your client relationships to restore the revenue multiple for the Meridian acquisition. In exchange you receive a vendor rate rather than your current client rate, and the accounts are again legally the property of Holt Strategic Partners and subsequently Meridian." I said, "That's how I read it." She said, "You are under no obligation to accept any arrangement with him. The non-compete as modified is satisfied. The account relationships are formally documented under Reeves Strategy letterheads. You have engagement letters signed by each client. You have been in active service to each of them for 6 weeks without a single challenge from Holt's side." I said, "What are my options?" She laid them out cleanly, the way she always does, without softening. Decline entirely and continue as I was. Accept the arrangement as described, which she did not recommend and said so directly. Or propose an inversion of the arrangement. I asked what that meant. She said, "You propose that Reeves Strategy is the primary firm on the Marchetti account and any accounts you currently hold. Holt operates as a subcontractor on any work that requires their specific capabilities. The accounts are classified in the Meridian data room under Reeves Strategy, not Holt Strategic Partners. The acquisition multiple for the Meridian Holt deal is calculated on Holt's actual remaining book." I said, He won't accept that, she said. Possibly not. But here is what it does regardless. It establishes your position clearly in writing before the meeting happens. It tells Meridian's attorneys, who will see whatever agreement is reached, that the accounts are in dispute, and that the person claiming them has documentation. And it tells Marcus that you understand exactly what the leverage is and that you are not going to give it back for a contractor rate. She paused. Then, there is also a third possibility I want you to be prepared for. He may come to the meeting with something other than the vendor arrangement. Something more significant. If the Meridian team has done their analysis, which they have, and if they understand that the revenue multiple they agreed to is tied to accounts that have moved to a new firm, they may propose an alternative that is worth considering. I asked what she meant. She said, an acquisition of Reeves strategy, rather than a subcontracting relationship. It would be unusual for Meridian at this stage of their deal but not impossible. Prepare for that conversation. I sat at my desk in the River North office, the second whiteboard on the wall behind me with the client list and the work in progress column and the sentence from the client about the same person promising and delivering. The plant Deb had brought on her first day was on the windowsill, doing quietly well. Outside, River North was going through its ordinary mid-morning Tuesday. A city that did not know and did not care what was being resolved on a specific floor of a specific building. I said, set up the meeting. My office. Petra said, good. I confirmed the call with Marcus that afternoon through a 2-sentence email. He responded within 8 minutes, which told me that his calendar for the foreseeable future was organized around this conversation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I chose the time deliberately. 10 on a Tuesday had been the time of my weekly strategy call with Vincent Marchetti Jr. for 4 years. It was the hour I was most alert, most clear, most fully in the work. I wanted to be at my best in the room. I also chose the room. My office, not a neutral venue, not a coffee shop, not the conference room down the hall at the hotel in the Loop where I had met with Vincent Jr. My office. The room where Reeves' strategy was written on the whiteboard and the client list was below it, and Deb Kwan could be seen through the glass door of the shared conference space taking a call with the focus she brought to every call she considered worth taking. I wanted him to see all of it. Not to be theatrical about it. Not to perform strength. I wanted the room to be accurate, to show what actually existed so that the conversation happened inside the truth of what the situation was rather than inside a negotiating posture. The most useful thing I had learned from years of client work was that conversations that happen inside accurate information reach better outcomes than conversations that happen inside managed impressions. I was not going to manage my impression. I was going to let the whiteboard do it. I spent the intervening days working. The Marchetti Fortis brief, now in final revision. A strategy memo for Valerie Cho about a planned service expansion the healthcare system was evaluating. A positioning document for Sandra Park's Holloway components ahead of their first major conference appearance, since the repositioning had taken effect. The ordinary work. Good work, done in the room where it was supposed to be done, under the name it was supposed to be under. On Monday evening, the night before the meeting, I called Deb into the office for 20 minutes. I told her the full picture, what Marcus had proposed on the call, and what the counterproposal would be, and what Petra had flagged about a possible acquisition offer. She listened with her full attention, which with Deb is a specific and recognizable quality, a stillness in the room that means all the usual small movements have stopped because something more important than movement is happening. When I finished, she said one thing. She said, whatever he offers, make sure you're deciding on the basis of what you want the firm to be in 5 years. Not what the number looks like today. I said, I know. She said, I know you know. I'm saying it anyway because I will not be in the room tomorrow and I want it to be the last thing you heard before you go in. I drove home. I ate dinner at the kitchen table in Lincoln Square. The same table I had sat at on the night of my birthday with the legal pad and the Reeves strategy document and the 2 words that had been enough to begin. I went to bed early. I slept without difficulty, which surprised me and also didn't. The clarity of a decision already made is its own rest. Marcus arrived on Tuesday at 9:58. He had always been punctual. Some things about a person do not change when the structure around them does. He was not the version of himself I had known for 7 years. He was the same height and the same silver at the temples and the same good jacket. But there was something different in the room around him, a narrowed quality, As if the confidence that usually occupied the space 6 inches beyond his physical outline had pulled back to exactly the edge of him. He looked at the office. He looked at the whiteboard. I watched his eyes move across the client list, the 4 names confirmed in writing, the 5th and final stages, the work in progress column with 11 items in it. He sat down across from me. He had a folder, which told me he had prepared a formal presentation of the arrangement. He was a man who came to meetings with documents. He opened the folder and he presented the structure he had described on the phone in more formal terms. Reeves Strategy as a preferred vendor partner under the Holt Meridian umbrella. Specific accounts designated in a schedule attached as Exhibit A. A fee structure that reflected a subcontractor rate. Quarterly performance reviews. A 12-month initial term with renewal options. He presented it with the genuine competence of someone who has been doing deals for 20 years, because he had, and that skill was real in him regardless of how the other things had gone. I took one note during the presentation. A single sentence. I wrote it on the legal pad I had brought, the same legal pad Petra had given me, the one I had been using since the beginning of all of this. When he finished, I put the pen down. I said, "I have a counteroffer." He looked at me without speaking. His hands, which had been moving slightly while he presented, became still. I laid out the third option. Reeves Strategy as the primary engagement firm on Marchetti, Midwest Healthcare and Halloway components, and any other accounts that had transferred. Holt operating as a subcontractor in any specific service areas where their capabilities complemented, rather than duplicated mine. The accounts classified in the Meridian data room under Reeves Strategy. The Meridian Holt acquisition valued on the basis of Holt's actual current book, which was the accurate number. Marcus was quiet for a longer beat than I expected. Then he said, "That is not how the deal has been structured." I said, "I know. But it is how the accounts exist. I have engagement letters signed by each client. I have 6 weeks of active service documented at those clients. And I have 3 formal termination letters from those clients to Holt Strategic Partners that cite the change in account leadership as the reason for non-renewal. Those letters are on public record in the form of the subsequent engagement agreements with my firm," he said. The Meridian attorneys would challenge that structure. I said they are welcome to. So would mine. And the conversation would be interesting because the documentation on my side is complete and unambiguous. He looked at me. And here is the thing I want to tell you about that moment because it was not what I had expected and not what I had prepared for. I had expected defensiveness. I had expected the version of him that pushes back and reframes and finds the angle that restores his position. He had been doing that version for 20 years in every difficult meeting I had watched him run. What I saw instead was something that looked like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been holding up a structure for a long time, and has finally run out of the conviction that the structure is worth the holding. He had built that structure on the belief that he was the reason the things around him worked. The termination letters and the Deb conversation and the Meridian due diligence revision had been showing him, one piece at a time, what the belief had been built on, which was the invisible and unacknowledged labor of a person who was no longer in the building. He said, "What do you actually want, Clara?" It was not the question I had expected him to reach. I had expected negotiating positions and revised terms and the well-practiced patience of someone who has done many deals. I had expected the professional version of him, the one who closes things. What I got was the real question. And I understood that it had come from the exhaustion rather than despite it. A man who still had options does not ask what someone actually wants. He makes offers. The real question came from the place where the options had narrowed down to just the truth of the situation. I said, "I want what I built. That is all I have ever wanted." He said, "The Marchetti account is the deal. Without Marchetti, Meridian renegotiates. The multiple comes down significantly." I said, "I know." He said, "So you understand what you have?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet. He looked at the whiteboard behind me and the client list beneath the firm name. He looked at Deb through the glass door, who was on a call and had not looked up once since Marcus arrived. Because Deb is the kind of person who does not perform normalcy, she is simply normal. He looked at the plant on the windowsill. I thought about what it looked like to him. The plant, the whiteboard, Deb on the call, the conference room table visible through the shared space glass. 6 weeks of building on a birthday night. The thing that had seemed like nothing from the outside. A person dismissed with 12 weeks of severance and a non-compete and a transition window, that had become the actual business, while the larger business it had come from was in negotiation about what it was worth without the thing it had lost. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "What if Meridian acquires Reeves Strategy instead?" I looked at him. He said, "Meridian is acquiring client relationships, not legal structures. If the relationships live at Reeves Strategy rather than at Holt, the acquisition can be structured to include Reeves Strategy as a standalone operating unit within the Meridian portfolio. You would retain the brand, the operational independence, the client relationships classified under your name. The Marchetti account stays yours within the Meridian structure." He paused. Then, "You would also receive a revenue multiple on your current book. At Meridian's standard terms." He said the multiple. He said it clearly and without hedging. I will not reproduce the number here, because the number is not the point of the story. But I understood in the moment he said it what the number meant for the next several years of my life, and I sat with that for a moment before I said anything. I thought about the mattress on the floor in the Wicker Park apartment, about the cracked windshield and the 2 boxes of books and the 3 part-time jobs at Ohio State, about the brief written on a weekend and sent at 10 on a Sunday night, and the Monday afternoon call that said Vincent Jr. asked who wrote it, about 7 years of invisible labor that had built a reputation good enough to become the central asset in a major acquisition, and how that labor had never once been named until the moment it was gone. And I thought about the apartment office in Lincoln Square and the legal pad and the 2 words at the top of a new document on the night of my birthday, and what it had taken to write them and mean them. I said, "I'll need 30 days to consider this with my attorney and my business partner." He said, "Meridian's timeline is 12 weeks. I said, "Then 30 days is early." He nodded. He stood. He extended his hand across the desk. It was the first time in 7 years he had offered me a handshake as an equal across a table rather than as a gesture of close of business courtesy. I shook it. He left. I sat in my office alone for a few minutes after he went. I looked at the whiteboard. I looked at the legal pad with the one note I had taken during his presentation, which said, "He knows." That was what I had written when it became clear during the first 5 minutes of his presentation that Marcus Holt fully understood, now, what he had dismissed. What the work had actually been and what it had actually been worth and whose name it had always deserved to be under. He had known since the first termination letter. He had understood more clearly with each one that followed. And he had driven to River North on a Tuesday morning and sat across from the person he had fired on her birthday and made an offer that acknowledged, in the only language he had ever been fluent in, which was the language of deal structure and revenue multiples and acquisition terms, that she had been the deal all along. Deb appeared in the doorway without knocking, which is what she does when she wants to know how a conversation went but is giving me the option to wave her off. I nodded her in. She sat down. I told her everything Marcus had said, including the acquisition offer and the multiple. She listened with the focused stillness she brings to information that matters. When I finished, she asked 2 questions, both practical. Then she asked the question that was not practical. She said, "What do you want to do? If you have ever built something that turned out to be worth more than the person who dismissed it understood, you know that this question has 2 answers. There is the answer that is about the number, and there is the answer that is about the thing itself." I spent the 30 days working. Not because I was using the time to decide, I knew what I was going to decide within the first week, but because the work was there and the work was good and I did not want to lose the thread of it for a negotiation that had already been resolved in the important way. The Marchetti Fortis brief reached its final version and was delivered to Vincent Jr.'s communications director on a Thursday morning. Valerie Cho approved the service expansion strategy. Sandra Park's Holloway components appeared at the industry conference and the trade press coverage was accurate and substantive and positioned the firm the way the work had been designed to position it. I also did something I had been putting off since the start of the Reeves strategy document. I wrote down what I wanted the firm to look like in 5 years. Not the revenue projection, not the headcount target, not the number of accounts. Those were outcomes and they would follow from other things. I wrote down the thing that Deb had asked me to hold on to before the meeting with Marcus, the question of what the firm was going to be rather than what it was going to earn. What I wrote was not long. I wrote that I wanted to run a firm where the person who made a promise to a client and the person who delivered on it were the same person. Where the client's market and their specific challenges were understood at the level of actual knowledge, rather than briefing documents. where the work of any given Tuesday was worth doing well because the value of the work was the point, not the value of the account to the firm's books. I wrote that I wanted to employ people who understood their own contribution to the work clearly enough that they did not need someone above them to tell them what it was worth, because I had been that person for 7 years and I understood what it cost. I read what I had written. It described exactly what Reeves Strategy was already doing in its first 3 months, which meant the decision about the Meridian offer was already made in the only way it could have been made, which was by understanding what I was choosing between. I was choosing between a number and the thing the number was a multiple of. The thing was the firm. In the second week I called my mother. She lives in Columbus still, in the same house on Greenlawn Avenue with the same garden that she tends with the same patient attention she has always given to things worth keeping. She answered on the second ring, the way she always does, as if she had been expecting the call. I told her everything. The Marcus phone call, the meeting, the Meridian offer, the number. I told her all of it in the real version rather than the managed one because that is always what I tell her. She was quiet for a moment. Through the phone I could hear the particular quality of her house in the afternoon, the refrigerator hum, the neighbor's dog somewhere on the street, the sounds of the house where I had learned to sit with problems until they became solvable. Then she asked, "What do you want to do, Clara?" I had been waiting for the question. Not because I did not know the answer, but because hearing the question from her made the answer arrive in the form it had been taking shape in all month rather than the form I had been trying to impose on it. There is something about the way she asks it, without inflection, without expectation in her voice, that strips away the noise around the answer and leaves only the answer itself. I said, I want the firm. I want it to be mine. I do not want to be a unit within a portfolio, even a standalone one with my name on it. I spent 7 years as an unnamed unit inside a structure that took the credit for what I produced. I am not doing that again in a different configuration, even a better one, even at a number that would change a lot of things. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's what I thought you'd say." I said, "Is that the right answer?" She said, "I have never known you to make a wrong decision about what you actually wanted. I've known you to make wrong decisions about what you were willing to accept. This doesn't sound like one of those." I sat with that for a moment. It was the most precise thing anyone had said to me in the entire year since the firing. The most useful sentence a person had offered, which was also the shortest. And it was exactly like her to deliver it that way. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Call me when you decide." Then, "I already know what you're going to decide." She was right. She usually is. I called Petra. I told her my decision. She said she had anticipated it and had already drafted the decline letter, which she knew me well enough to have prepared. The letter went to Meridian's attorneys on a Thursday morning 3 weeks into the 30-day window. The decline was framed as a decision to maintain Reeves Strategy's operational independence, which was accurate, and included a counterproposal for an arm's-length preferred vendor relationship between Reeves Strategy and the Holt Meridian portfolio, which was what I had offered in the meeting and which I expected them to accept because it preserved access to the client relationships without requiring the acquisition structure. They accepted within 4 days. The Meridian acquisition of Holt Strategic Partners closed on a Thursday in late July. Deb heard it through a contact who was still at Holt and texted me a single line. It closed. Then, at a significant discount to the original projection. Then after a pause 8 times. Not 12. I knew already, from the public record and from Petra's network, that the multiple had come down. I knew what the difference between 8 times and 12 times meant in dollar terms for Marcus Holt specifically. I did not feel triumphant about it. I want to be honest about that. I had not set out to damage his deal. I had set out to keep what I built. The damage to his deal was a consequence of the choices he had made rather than a consequence of anything I had done beyond keeping what was mine. He had fired me on my birthday without registering the date. He had cited the non-compete with confidence that it would hold. He had believed the accounts were the firm's rather than the person's. Each of those choices had a consequence. The consequences arrived in the form of 3 termination letters and a revised revenue multiple and a Tuesday morning in a small River North office where the person he had underestimated sat across from him with a legal pad and a single note and said, "I have a counteroffer." That was not revenge. That was the math. 1 year after the firing, Reeves Strategy had 7 active client engagements, 2 full-time staff, 2 part-time research contractors, and a lease on a proper office space in a building 2 blocks from the one we had started in. The revenue for the first year landed considerably above the conservative projection I had written on the night of my birthday. The second-year projection at the current run rate was higher still. The 2 research contractors were both people I had known for years. One was the media monitoring service account rep, who had told me on a call in March that she had wondered when I was going to do exactly this. She had transitioned from an employee role at her previous company to a freelance practice, which she had been wanting to do for some time, and Reeve Strategy was now her largest client. She did work that the larger research firms charged 3 times as much for and produced at half the accuracy, because she knew the clients understood the context and had been trained by years of doing the work rather than by a standardized process designed for interchangeable analysts. The other contractor was a content strategist in Indianapolis whose name I had referred to 3 different clients over the years and who had now reversed the referral back to me twice. That is how referral networks work when the people inside them are doing actual work. They become self-reinforcing because one person's quality reflects on the people they recommend and the people they recommend reflect on them, and everyone in the network has an interest in the network being good. I had built that network for years without a structure to put it in. The structure was now there. The network now had somewhere to go. Deb's 2 contractors were similarly people she had known and trusted for years, brought in through the same patient-specific attention she applies to everything. She had an instinct for people who did the actual work rather than the version of it that looks good in a status update, and that instinct applied to the building of a team was the kind of thing that could not be replicated from a hiring process. It came from years of working alongside people and noticing what distinguished the ones who stayed good under pressure from the ones who performed well without it. That was the firm at 1 year. Not a large firm. Not a firm that had grown through acquisition or capital raise or the scaling mechanisms that turn good work into standardized service. A firm that had grown through the accumulation of trust, one client at a time, starting from the relationships that had been real before the structure that housed them was removed. The new office had 3 rooms. A main workspace for Deb and me and the research contractors on the days they came in. A proper conference room with a table that seated 6, which felt like an almost absurd luxury after the shared conference space in River North, and which Deb said was not a luxury but a signal that a firm with a conference table of its own was communicating something different to clients than a firm that borrowed one. She was right. She usually is. And a 3rd room that I used as a private office and where I kept the original whiteboard, the one that had been in the apartment and then in River North, with Reeve Strategy at the top in blue marker that was beginning to fade at the edges because I had written it a year ago and had not erased it. I had written the things below it in newer marker, in the original blue. The client list. The principles. The sentence from the client about the same person promising and delivering. The note from Vincent Jr. that said this is correct in 3 words. The original 2 words at the top were the ones I did not rewrite. I thought of them as the foundation. You do not replace the foundation once the building is standing. The Marchetti Fortis acquisition closed on schedule in the fall, and the communications campaign we built for it ran for 6 months across trade press, investor relations, and regional market positioning. It repositioned Marchetti Group from a legacy automotive supplier to a leading industrial supply platform in the Great Lakes region. The campaign won a Regional Communications Industry Award in the spring. I sent the award certificate to my mother in Columbus and she put it on the refrigerator because that is where she puts things she is proud of, next to a photograph of the garden in August and a card Emma had made for her in 3rd grade. Vincent Marchetti Jr. sent me a note after the first major trade press coverage of the Fortis announcement ran. He did not write much. He wrote, "This is correct." 3 words. I kept the email in a folder I labeled simply, right? Valerie Cho referred 2 more healthcare organizations to Reeve Strategy in the first year. Both became clients. Sandra Park's Halloway Components grew into one of the larger accounts in the portfolio as their growth initiative accelerated, and the communications needs deepened. They had renewed twice and were planning a 3rd renewal at an expanded scope. Deb brought in 2 clients entirely on her own. Through the specific quality she has always had of making people feel genuinely seen and then delivering work that proves the attention was real, not performed. One of those clients told her 3 months into the engagement that she had called Reeve Strategy specifically because someone in the industry had told her it was the only firm where the person who promises you something and the person who delivers it are the same person. I put that sentence on the 3rd whiteboard, The one I bought when we moved from River North to the new space. It is still there. I look at it occasionally and think about how long that had been true across how many briefs and how many calls and how many Sunday evenings spent in trade publications and how many Tuesday mornings when the 7 a.m. call came in and I answered it, and how long it had taken the truth to have a door with my name on it. The answer to how long it took is not the interesting part of the answer. The interesting part is that it had been true the whole time. The door is the last thing. The work is what precedes it, and the work does not wait for the door. The Marchetti campaign ran for 6 months. It won a regional industry award in the spring. The award exists now on my mother's refrigerator in Columbus, next to the garden photograph and a card my niece made for her in 3rd grade. My mother did not ask where to put it. She had a place for it already. Vincent Jr. sent a note the week the first major trade press piece ran. 3 words. This is correct. I kept it in a folder I labeled right. Not because I needed the validation, I knew the work was right before the piece ran, but because it was accurate and because the things that are accurate deserve to be kept. 3 words from a man who does not spend words he does not mean, which makes 3 words from Vincent Marchetti Jr. worth more than a paragraph from almost anyone else. Marcus Holt sent one more email, about 4 months after the Meridian deal closed. It was professional and brief and written with the quality of something that had been composed and deleted and recomposed several times before it was sent. He said the transition had been handled with more grace than he had deserved, and that he had had time to think clearly about what had been built at the firm and who had built it. He said he thought I would do well. The email had 4 sentences. I read it twice. The sentence he had not written was implied by the gap between the 4 he had written, that he understood now it had not needed to happen the way it happened, that the date had mattered, that the person sitting in the chair across from his desk on a Tuesday morning in March had been more than a position that had been reviewed and eliminated. He had not found a way to write that sentence and I did not need him to. The understanding was in the gap. It was enough. I did not respond. Not from malice, not from the satisfaction of making him wait. I did not respond because I had nothing to add. The situation had already said everything there was to say, and the email was not asking for a response. It was asking, in the only way he knew how to ask for something without appearing to ask, for acknowledgement that he had finally seen what had always been there. The acknowledgement was in the 7 client names on the whiteboard, in the award on my mother's refrigerator, in the phone that had rung on a Tuesday morning in late spring with a number I recognized as Marcus Holt's personal cell, and that I had picked up from a position of complete calm because the firm behind me was real and mine and built on work that had always been mine, regardless of whose name had been on the door at the time. The acknowledgement was in everything that had happened in the 6 months after he called me into his office on my 35th birthday, and told me my position had been eliminated. It was not in an email. Deb asked me about it at lunch the usual Wednesday back at the Vietnamese place, which we had kept as a standing habit through everything because some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. The foe was the same. The theory about its restorative properties was ongoing. The window we sat beside let in the same angle of Chicago light it always had. She asked what the email said and I told her. She ate her soup for a moment. Then she said, "He figured out what he fired." I said, "Eventually everyone does." She said, "Does it matter?" I thought about that. The real version of the question. About the birthday cake. With the lemon filling sitting in the break room on a Tuesday morning while Marcus said the word transition and handed me 12 weeks of severance and the weight of a non-compete he believed would hold. About the note I had written on my kitchen table that night and erased 6 weeks later because I was done needing it. About the 35 years that had built toward that night and the year that had built away from it. I said, "Not the way it used to." That is the truth. It took a year and 6 months and a significant amount of specific careful work to arrive at cleanly. Not that it does not matter when someone looks through you for 7 years and then discovers you were the thing they were looking for. It matters. The recognition matters and the late recognition has its own specific sting. But recognition arriving 12 months after the fact is not the same as recognition at the time. There is no version of late understanding that accounts for the 7 years of building something while someone else put their name on the output. What matters, and what I understood sitting at that table with the soup and the Wednesday afternoon and Deb across from me, is that the building was never contingent on the recognition. I built what I built because the work was worth doing well. Because the clients deserved the sustained specific attention they were getting. Because telling Vincent Jr. what I actually thought rather than what he wanted to hear was the right thing to do regardless of whether Marcus would ever know it was me who had done it. I built it before anyone named it. I built it when no one was going to credit it. I built it on Tuesday mornings and Sunday evenings and at 7 in the morning when a phone rang and I picked it up. The work was always mine regardless of whose name was on the door. And when the door was gone, the work was still there. The 7 a.m. calls. The trust that accumulates in years of real conversation. The 42%. It went where it had always actually lived, which was with the person who had built it because that is where it had always been. That is what I want to leave you with. Not the revenue multiple or the industry award or the 7 clients on the whiteboard, or even the look on Marcus Holt's face in the River North office when he understood what he had given away on a birthday morning, while the cake sat 2 doors down the hall. I want to leave you with the document I opened on my 35th birthday night, at my kitchen table in Lincoln Square, with a glass of water going warm and the legal pad and the north-facing windows showing the dark. I typed 2 words at the top. I sat with them for a moment. I let myself believe they were real, which was the only thing that had been missing from the previous 7 years. Not the work and not the skill and not the relationships, but the room to believe that the name at the top could be mine. Reeves Strategy. The work was always mine. It just needed a door. There is one more thing I want to say before I close this story. I think about the birthday cake occasionally. The one with the lemon filling, sitting in the break room on a Tuesday morning in March while Marcus said the words my position had been eliminated. Deb had ordered it from the bakery 3 blocks out of the way because I had mentioned lemon filling once 2 years earlier, in a conversation I had almost forgotten. She had remembered it and acted on it because that is how she does everything, with specific attention to the actual person in front of her. Marcus had not remembered the date. I think about the difference between those 2 things. The person who carries a detail about lemon filling for 2 years and acts on it without making a production of it. And the person who looks at a calendar, sees the date, and proceeds anyway because the date does not rise to the level of information he is tracking. The difference is not kindness versus cruelty. It is attention versus the absence of it. It is the question before the agenda, the one more thing at the end of the call, the industry publication read on a Sunday morning, the brief sent at 10 on a Sunday night. It is the thing I had always done and the thing Marcus had never understood was the mechanism rather than the result. You cannot separate the work from the person who does it. You can try to separate the credit. The credit transfers. The work stays where it lives. It lives in the room where someone is paying attention. I am still in that room. I will keep being in that room. The whiteboard still says Reeves Strategy at the top in blue marker that is now faded nearly to the texture of the board itself, because I wrote it on the night of my 35th birthday and I have not erased it and I will not erase it. Not because I need the reminder. Because it was the beginning of saying out loud what had always been true, and the beginnings of true things deserve to stay visible. That is the story. The birthday cake, the birthday firing, the legal pad, the 2 words at the top of the document, the door. If you are doing the invisible work right now, you have the only thing that matters. Everything else follows from the work. Give it a door. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours, and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.